John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory.
Welcome to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I am your host, Leon, and this is a reading of the history of the 72nd Indiana Volunteer Infantry of the Mounted Lightning Brigade. Chapter 17. December 26, 1862 to January 8, 1863. The New Revelry. Ordered to march. Forced march through the rain to the Rock House and Scottsville. A 2 days wade. Frozen in the mud. Close up and wade big, barren river. We may forage a little. At Glasgow, fresh mutton and pork, chickens and applejack, and a regimental spree. To Bear Wallow. Mule Brigade that didn't chase Morgan. To Cave City in the storm that upset tents. News from the great battle at Stone River. A victory on the Emancipation Proclamation. March to Murfreesboro. On the battlefield. Limbs found in tents. Bodies in the waters, and devastation everywhere. What's the matter, da? Into camp at Murfreesboro on the Hickory Flats. Up to this time, all our movements had been regulated by fife and drum. On the morning of the 26th, just before day, a bugler at Colonel Wilder's headquarters blew reveille. The men bounced up at once at this new sound, supposing it might mean that the rebels were coming in fury upon us. Before fully dressed, the breakfast call was blown, and before breakfast a furious blast was blown, which, we were informed, meant to strike tents and prepare to march. Breakfast was not half eaten, but we arose and promptly hauled down tents, and before we had them ready, the regimental teams came up in a sweeping trot. Something was up, we knew. Before the wagons were loaded, the drums rolled out orders to fall in. And before the sun was up, we were moving out to the pike, wondering whether we were to go to the main army now advancing on Murfreesboro, or to Hartsville and attack Morgan. At the pike, we were halted and company commanders ordered to send every man not able for a forced march to Gallatin. Many were really sick, and many who were not sick were not able for a long forced march, and some few played sick and fell out, which left each company about 50 men, half the number at muster in. Of the number who fell out and were sent to Gallatin Hospital, 27 died. What a terrible mortality. We were to chase Morgan once more, and turned our faces northwards. Reynolds' whole division was in the column. Just then, a cold rain began to fall, and continued all day. We moved directly north to the Rock House, and went into camp on the ground we had occupied just a month before. The marching had been miserable, the mud ankle-deep, water often knee-deep, and we went into camp wet, muddy, and very tired. On the 27th, we moved on to Scottsville, that famous rural town. We marched all day in rear of our train, and the rain came down in torrents. We had to march much of the time right up little branches, through water from 6 inches to 1.5 feet deep, and through mud from 3 inches to a foot deep. When we went into camp at Scottsville, many of us were so coated with mud to the waist that we waded into the creek where it was 2 feet deep and washed the mud off our clothes. The whole regiment wore shoes, and as we had marched 40 miles in 2 days through rain, mud, and water, and over sharp stones, the condition of our feet might be better imagined than described. Some of us had worn our shoes out, and our feet were raw and bleeding at every step. Almost everyone's feet were very much blistered and sore. With but little cooked rations, for it was difficult to get wood, everything was so wet, we wrapped up in our blankets to spoon to the right or left, as the case might be, until morning. During the night it turned cold. The rain turned to snow, and by morning the ground was frozen an inch deep. It was hard to pull out of the frozen earth on the 28th and resume our march, but it had to be done. And we struck out early on the Glasgow road, tarrying not in Old Scottsville. We made another 20 miles that day, which was clear and cool, but quite muddy. About an hour before sundown, we came to the Big Barren River, where we were commanded to strip and wade. The river was swollen, and an ice an inch thick had formed along the shore. We stripped off our pantaloons and began to yell, "Close up, close up, close up." With pants, shoes, and socks, gun and haversack elevated in the air, we waded into the water and modestly elevated our hog hair shirts as the water encroached on the lower borders thereof. The water was almost to the armpits of the short men, and cold, boo. Just as we were wading in, a smart orderly rode up and called out, "Colonel Wilder says for you to close up here." Some fellow who had his shirt up to his neck yelled out, "Bear my compliments to the colonel, and tell him I can't get clothes an inch higher without tearing them off." There was many a slip and tumble in getting into the bluff-banked stream, and the officers and orderlies formed a line below to catch those who might be washed down by the river, which ran as swift as a racehorse. We crossed without serious casualty, though many got handsome duckings and wet hog skins. As soon as we crossed the river, we went into camp, where dry rails were abundant, and if we didn't burn thousands of them that night, then we are no historian. And if the country round about was not foraged thoroughly for something to eat, then we were not good soldiers. The rain had spoiled all our rations, and we were in a manner out. On the morning of the 29th, before we marched, Colonel Miller told us that as our rations were out we might forage some, but to be moderate and discreet. We had anticipated him a little, but cheered as though it was a new-born privilege. We availed ourselves of it during the day, but little as we moved rapidly, making 20 miles through forests over hills and rocks. We crossed the Little Barren River on a log in the forenoon, and went into camp near Glasgow late in the afternoon. When we got to Glasgow, our rations were utterly exhausted, and we had to forage. Some of us remained in camp and built fires, while others went out to bring in something to eat. They found sheep, hogs, chickens, and turkeys in abundance, and also bought large quantities of meal, cornbread, biscuits, and flour from the citizens. A mill was pressed to grind meal and flour for the boys. Soon the camp smelled as savory as Jerusalem of old on burnt offering day. Hundreds of fires smoked with fresh meats. Mingled with this odor of meats was one never smelt in Jerusalem, the odor of applejack. The boys had found a still house, full of this jolly Kentucky beverage, and almost every man in the regiment got drunk. Of course there were exceptions, but it was called general and glorious drunk by the oldest judges of that article. 'Twas a night of feasting, frolic, fun, song, and dance. Every fellow seemed to forget his sore feet, his tattered shoes, and all his ills, and go in for a good time. Those that were not drunk laughed themselves almost outside in. There were times afterwards when 2 or 3 companies would get well filled, but this is the only time when every man in the regiment who would indulge got 3 sheets in the wind. Yet, be it said to the credit of the regiment, there were many men who could, under no circumstances, be induced to touch a drop, and the boys didn't get on much of a high, after all. The fiddler of Company I felt pretty well, and to his music hundreds of the boys danced in their tattered shoes and stockings until there was scarce a bit of either left. We remained at Glasgow all day the 30th, and on the 31st we started north again before daylight. We marched 15 miles to a place called Bear Wallow, a mere sign of a crossroad town, getting there just after noon. Here it first became known to the men generally that we were after Morgan, who had been raiding upon the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, our main line of communication in Kentucky. On January 1st, while at Bear Wallow, we learned that Morgan was making his way back into Tennessee. That evening, just after sundown, the long roll beat, and we were just 3 minutes forming line, being in line several times before any other regiment. The enemy did not come, and we lay on our arms all night. The movements of Morgan were closely observed and reported by scouts, and we knew he was hovering around us and measuring our strength and position. On this very evening of January 1st, 1863, near night, when firing was heard north of us, and the report came that Morgan was passing around our right flank, Colonel Wilder, anxious to give chase, attempted to mount a lot of men on the team of mules of the division. The mules were brought out in great haste, and each one shaking his tail as if he knew there were extra duty demanded. Not more than 1 mule out of 6 had ever had a man on its back, and never wanted to have. The order to mount was given, and the bold men and officers each leaped upon his mule. Each mule gave a bray, brought his head between his forefeet as his heels flew high into the air, and each man also flew high into the air and flopped down in the mud. The mules wiggled their tails, shook their heads, and became as demure as Quakers. The brave men picked themselves up out of the mud, and each went for his mule again, and sprang upon their backs. The mules turned a handspring as before, sending the men tumbling into the air. Scarcely a man stuck except those that got on the saddle mules. Soon the mules seemed to understand the game, and began to jump onto each other's backs, some of them climbing on behind the men that had stuck and knocking them off. Some ran under the bellies of other mules and hoisted them from the ground, and in a minute they were as badly tangled as a den of snakes, braying piteously, shaking their tails and kicking up and down, right and left. In vain, those holding the bridles while others tried to mount shouted "Whoa!" with a chorus of mill dams, coffer dams, and all sorts of dams. It was worse than a battery of grape and canister, and the mule line had to be abandoned, upon which they untangled, shook their tails, and were soon at their respective wagons eating hay as solemnly as hypocrites. The 72nd had no part in this farce, except to do the laughing. The 17th did the swearing. It is said that this attempt to form a mule brigade to chase Morgan was the conception of the idea which resulted in Colonel Wilder having the brigade mounted some months afterwards. We had been chasing Morgan's force, which was mounted on the best blooded horses of the South, in mule wagons and on foot, and the colonel, seeing the futility of such chases, determined that he would try and have a brigade mounted so as to travel as rapidly as Morgan could. So the attempt to form the mule brigade was prolific, if not successful, at Bear Wallow. When Hartsville was abandoned, the way was left open into Kentucky, and Morgan, with 6,000 cavalry, 8 pieces of artillery, and 2 howitzers, marched rapidly on the 24th of December for Bowling Green, tore up the railroad, and did a great deal of mischief. But being assailed in front, rear, and flanks, he fled towards Tennessee. Reynolds' division had been hurried forward to intercept him. But although we marched 20 miles a day, the old fox flanked around and got away. An old Kentuckian, who came into our camp to protest against our burning his rails, was treated with marked civility by officers and men. He was asked why this place was called Bear Wallow. "You see that thar pond up yonder, don't you?" We said, "Yes, sir." "Well, long time ago, when I fust settled here, bears used to come and waller in it, and when the post office was made at these crossroads in my house, we called it Bear Waller. While we were on this march, the great Battle of Stone River was being fought, and but for the chase after Morgan, we would have participated in it. January 2nd, and in the afternoon, we moved some 14 miles from Bear Wallow to Cave City on the L&N Railroad to take the cars for Nashville. We were very anxious to learn the result of the Battle of Murfreesboro, and also of what had come of the Emancipation Proclamation, as we had heard nothing from the world since the 25th. We moved through woods and fields over a mere country trail to Cave City, arriving in the night and rain. Our wagons were there, and tents were hastily put up to keep off the rain. Just before daylight, a most terrific wind and rainstorm struck the camp. The tents flopped and rattled. Men jumped up to hold them down, some with no garments on but their shirts, which cracked and popped in the storm like volleys of musketry. Hallooing, braying, and confusion was in the air, and down came almost every tent. The air was full of hats, caps, breeches, drawers, and everything that a mighty wind could move, chased by men in their shirts. It was the most ridiculous scene ever witnessed in the regiment. Men were hunting pantaloons and other articles for some time after daylight. It was the first night for over a week that we had an opportunity to sleep like white folks, and to be raided by a rebel wind in that style was too vexatious. The sun came up bright and warm, and gave the men a chance to dry blankets and clothing. Near our camp was a peculiar cave, the mouth of which was funnel-shaped, 50 feet across at the top, just as deep as wide. A deep pool in the center of the bottom, where a hydraulic ram worked and pumped water to a railroad track a mile distant. From the pool, a cave ran to the northeast, no telling how far. Some of us followed it a mile. We had to get into the cave by passing over some slabs that lay over the pool. Some of the 17th Indiana men squatted down on the slabs, and as we attempted to pass them, Captain Watts, Company I, accidentally pushed one of them in, which made lots of fun, and lots of cursing, too, from that fellow that got ducked. We lay at this camp until the 5th of January, during which time we heard that Rosecrans's army had gained a great victory over Bragg, compelling him to evacuate his works at Stone River, leave Murfreesboro, and flee for Duck River. This gave wonderful cheer to the troops. We also learned that the President had issued his Emancipation Proclamation. While we lay here, the inevitable drill was attended to for part of each day, and getting wood the other part of the day. One day, Major Carr was drilling the battalion, and Captain Hanna, getting a little tangled, disputed the correctness of one of the major's commands and refused to execute it. This astonished everyone, for the major was very bright in the tactics. After some parley, Captain Hanna, who was notorious for knowing very little of the tactics, executed the command under protest. After going off drill, the captain went to the major's quarters and offered an apology, saying that he was wrong and the major was correct. "Well, why didn't you say so on drill?" asked the major with warmth. "Why do you suppose, Major Carr, that I am such a dashed fool as to acknowledge before my company that I am wrong?" replied the captain with solemn emphasis. On the afternoon of the 5th, we began to pack up and put our equipage on the train to go to Nashville. The hardest things to load were the mules, many of which had to be literally lifted up and shoved into the doors despite their kicking and braying. We ran to Nashville that night, and it was a miserable duplicate of the ride from Indianapolis to Jeffersonville. It was a box and flat car train. The artillery was put on the flat cars, and half our regiment on top the box cars. It was our fortune, as usual, to be put on top. The first part of the night was bitter cold, and about midnight it began to rain. And soon we were wet to the skin. We were so overcome with fatigue that we could not resist sleep, and taking our gunslings, we strapped ourselves to the footboard to keep from rolling off, and were thumped and banged until daylight, when we arrived at Nashville, running 100 miles in a little over 14 hours. The miserable old train just flew down some of the grades and crawled up others. That morning, the 6th, we marched through the muddy streets of Nashville and decamped 3 miles southwest of it, expecting to stay a few days. But that very night we got orders to draw clothing and prepare to march in the morning. As we had not drawn any clothing since we enlisted, except overcoats, and as we had one of the muddiest marches soldiers ever made, we were dirty and ragged beyond description, and as previously hinted, some were a little gray-backish. The whole regiment drew a complete new outfit, except dress coats, and we also drew new gum blankets. This work was not finished until midnight, and yet there were several men in each company for whom there were no pantaloons big enough, and a special requisition had to be sent to Nashville to get harness they could work in. There were 5 sergeants in Company I whose combined weight was 1,000 pounds. At 2 a.m. of the 7th, reveille sounded. We got up in the snow and took breakfast at 4, got into Nashville by dawn, and learned that we were to go to Murfreesboro with the 17th Indiana and 19th Indiana Battery, as advance guard for a train of 3,000 wagons that were loaded with rations for the army at that place. There was a thin snow on the ground, which melted as the sun arose and made walking sloppy. We had all drawn new shoes. The pike was torn to pieces by the movement of heavy artillery over it, and full of sharp stones and immense mud holes. The shoes pinched and blistered our feet, for a pike is far worse than a dirt road to march over. We found very rapidly, and before night, almost half the men had fallen out of ranks. We marched 35 miles that day, including 3 miles from camp to Nashville, and the last 10 of it was exquisite torture. Blisters formed and bursted upon the feet that day by scores. But the brave victors at Stone River needed food, and we would not halt as long as we could move one foot after the other. Many of the teams gave out, and several mules smothered in the mud holes in which they fell exhausted. The poor mule is odd, but he has never had a proper eulogium pronounced of his service, his suffering, and his patriotism, and we are sorry to say there is no space in these pages for so great a spread. We went into camp 3 miles from Murfreesboro on one of the battlefields, every foot of which had been fought over. Indeed, all the way from Nashville to Stone River was scarred by the great struggle. But as we neared that river, the evidence of the fearful conflict became more ghastly and startling. Many pages could be taken in describing the ravages of the battle. In many places, the hedges and underbrush have been mown down like weeds by the leaden storm of musketry. In other places, great trees were torn limb from limb, and some even blown up at the roots. One large tree had been perforated by 7 large shells. Huge pieces had been torn out of it, but it still stood like a scarred veteran. The ground in the forest was covered by limbs cut from the trees by cannon shot and shell. Hundreds of horses lay upon the ground, torn and mangled. It was after dark when we got into camp. When we built our fires, a man's leg was found in our quarters. Cold comfort. A Company C man picked up a rebel canteen and threw it in the fire, and in a few minutes it exploded and wounded a man seriously. This was hot comfort, and convinced us of the truth of the statement, which we had often heard, that rebel soldiers had gunpowder and whiskey furnished to them to make them fight furiously. Indeed, we afterwards picked up many a rebel canteen, which had gunpowder in it and smelled of whiskey, which leaves no doubt of the fact in our mind. In hunting for water, we found a pond, and filled our camp kettles and did our cooking with the water. Next morning, we went to that pond for more water, and found 2 dead rebels lying in it, frozen in the ice. We went to Stone River, nearly a mile away, to get water, and when we got to it, there lay another dead rebel in the edge of the water. The reflection that we had drank coffee made from the wasting of dead rebels was not pleasant, but such is war. Many men from that bloody field were buried hurriedly in out-of-the-way places, and often not very deep. We know of several instances where wagons would pass over the bodies, and the head, hands, or feet would fly up out of the soft ground as ghosts rising from the earth. We shall never forget a horrible incident where a wagoneer accidentally drove over one of these shallow graves, and a man's hand flew out of the ground. "Look at that fellow grabbing at my wagon wheel!" roared out the rough soldier. On the 8th, we started late, and moved leisurely over the battlefield of the second day's fight, noting with curiosity and deep interest the many scars and seams of the terrible carnage. After crossing Stone River, we went into an old field on a high ground to rest. The Pioneer Corps was very busy felling trees just north of us to be used in building a bridge. A lot of teams were waiting to haul away the timber. A Negro who drove a team had lain down in his wagon and gone to sleep. A large tree began to fall near his 6-mule team. Creaking and crashing as it came down, the mules sprang forward and began to run at full speed. In 10 rods the front axle hit solid on a big stump. Every mule broke loose, faced square about, and stood still as if amazed. The wagon bed flew 10 feet into the air and came down with a crash. We expected the Negro was mashed into jelly, but he kinda roused up a little, looked around and said, "What's the matter, sir?" When our regiment roared with laughter, he looked at us with a bewildered expression, as if we were all fools. We moved through Murfreesboro a mile east onto the McMinnville Pike, and went into camp south of the road, in a very flat piece of ground heavily wooded, Hickory Flats. That's precisely what it was. This was a week after the battle, yet everything was in confusion. We were now encamped in line by brigades, along with all our division, and were, for the first time, regularly incorporated into the Army of the Cumberland. And that is going to be the end of our episode. We will do chapter 18 next week. I will be there. I am done moving, finally, into my new place. I wish I could show you where I live now, but if I showed you, you'd be able to instantly identify me, and I can't have that happening. I still have our house, but... Alright, anyway, let's get into some show notes. First of all, 3 sheets into the wind. I absolutely love that they use that expression. I know is from naval tradition, but I just love that they're they're using it, or that McGee is using it here in this context of the whole regiment getting absolutely wasted together and having a great time. Absolutely love that, and I think it's so great that they get to have that core memory together before it pretty much gets woken up by the reality of war. So these guys aren't even combat veterans yet. I mean, technically they are, but they haven't shot and engaged the rebels in regular combat yet. They've always been on the outside of it. So what a really interesting way to be able to look at a regiment that's trying to hold it together to get to its battlefield role. Traveling 40 miles in 2 days through mud and rain and puddles and crossing a river and spooning for warmth and it's icy and moving so quickly to do it, as good soldiers do. This is incredible work as infantrymen. You talk about the reduced troop counts, how it's 50 men per company. That's what they're down to, just 500, roughly. So they're already down at half strength. And we're giving special note that 27 soldiers die at just one hospital. Which is just a very visual recollection of the type of suffering that they're going through. All right. Our next great big scene is the 17th Indiana getting to witness, or the 72nd Indiana, witnessing the 17th Indiana trying to mount mules for the first time. And our brilliant author, McGee here, regales us with the story of, what amounts to a mule riot, right? Is that what it would be called? Does that sound right to anybody else? The description does to me, so I could envision it in my head as he was writing about it. The fact that it was close to dark is pretty funny. So, the next section is, the great calamity that they have as a regiment, where all of their clothes and pants and everything are blown away and all of their tents collapse in this huge windstorm. Makes for dramatic imagery. Is pretty funny. But what stuck out to me was the very ending. McGee wrote, "It was for the first night for over a week that we had an opportunity to sleep like white folks." Unquote. So such a direct comment from his time period to kind of point us front and center about what the expectations are with racial hierarchy in the American Civil War. Like, if you get to have a nice restful sleep, that's something that is apparently only typical for white people. And the fact that he had terrible sleep makes him feel less than, which is very interesting. There's just a lot that's going on. Oh my gosh. Okay, so the next thing I want to note is the 5 sergeants who weighed 1,000 pounds. I just love little notes about that. Just give me their weight. How do they like to eat their corn? What else can you give me? So, the next thing that's covered in this chapter is gunpowder and the whiskey. Now, I went and searched high and low, and what I can tell you from my observation is that, yeah, maybe they actually had gunpowder in their whiskey. I found histories on gunpowder in whiskey. I have found historical figures that have had gunpowder in their whiskey. Blackbeard was apparently one of those. There's some sort of naval tradition that's part of it. But I was not, and I did find other Union soldier accounts of the gunpowder whiskey thing with rebel canteens. But I haven't yet found any Confederate ones. So I'm not sure if people were holding gunpowder in their canteens and they had whiskey in it previously, so it smelled like whiskey, and they were holding gunpowder in a canteen, I guess. I mean, maybe. So I'm going to kind of, quote unquote, trust the Union accounts on this for right now, but I'm going to put an asterisk next to it. So if you know any information about Confederate soldiers willingly talking about whiskey in their canteen mixed with gunpowder, and why they liked it, I would like to know. Apparently, it's to make you fight like the devil, and that's why some other people have done it. There's also the effects of saltpeter as a preservative and a couple of other things. So, all right, if you have any information, you can email me at waroftherebellion at gmail.com. So, reach out to me. I'd be very interested. So, but definitely put an asterisk next to that until we get something more permanent. Maybe it's already out there and I missed it, but all right. The next and gruesome section is all about the battlefield as they move across it, finding out your water source is contaminated. I mean, at least they boiled their coffee, but still it's super gross. Just, ugh. not going to repeat a lot of the gruesome sights that they talked about because I'm sure we're going to get our fill of that now that they're finally joining the rest of the army. But must have definitely been a very sobering moment for the soldiers to come to this battlefield and see the absolute destruction two armies locked in a titanic clash actually looks like. And the fact that we're mentioned about the scars of the battlefield last all the way from Nashville kind of puts it into perspective, I think, definitely. So, well, they're part of the Army of the Cumberland now, and that's an excellent way to end the chapter, being incorporated into the Army. So we will see what happens next week, Mush Eaters. Thank you for listening. I will catch you in the next episode. And if you want, I have a Union Radio playlist of American Civil War music and new American Civil War music that's rewritten, published on the YouTube channel, War of the Rebellion. You can come take a look at it. It has a picture of Abraham Lincoln on the front, although he's been slightly modified to look like the God Emperor of Mankind, if you're a Warhammer 40k fan. And it's just for fun, and nothing is sacred or safe, so come check it out if you like. We're also still playing War of Rights, so if you would like to hang out or come play sometime, you're always welcome to reach out to me through Discord or through email if you want. You can also talk to me there. And I'm still playing regularly every, couple of times a week with my own regiment. So if you want to come hang out and talk or do whatever, Wednesdays and Saturdays are our regimental battles, and those are happening later in the after evening, I should say, for the West Coast, usually around 5 p.m. So, all right, that's all my news that I've got. I am finally settled in one spot, mostly. So it's good to just finally be able to relax. All right, Mush Eaters, thanks for listening. I'll catch you in the next episode, and have a great one. Bye-bye now.
The hours sad I left a maid, a lingering farewell taking, whose sighs and tears my steps delayed. I thought her heart was breaking. In hurried words her name I blessed, I breathed the vows that bind me, and to my heart in anguish pressed the girl I left behind me. Then to the east we bore away, to win a name and story. And there where dawns the sun of day, there dawned our sun of glory. The place in my sight, when in the host assigned me, I shared the glory of that fight. Sweet girl I left behind me, though many a name our banner bore, former deeds of daring, but they were of the day of yore, in which we had no sharing. But now our laurels freshly won, with the old one shall entwine me, singing worthy of our sighs each son. Sweet girl I left behind me. The hope of final victory within my bosom burning is mingling with sweet thoughts of thee and of my fond returning. But should I here return against and with thy love I'll bind me, dishonor's breath shall never stay. The name I leave behind me. no hope of final victory, within my bosom burning is mingling with sweet thoughts of thee and of my fond return. But should I in here return again, still with thy love I'll bind me. Dishonest breath shall never stay. The name I